Let's get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Steve Donovan, the Director of Alumni Relations at Trinity. I hope you are all well as October races past and we soon head into the holiday season already. I took a walk an hour or so ago. The campus is still in much of its fall splendor, and we haven't even had a frost yet here in Hartford. Our students are just finishing up midterms. The football team is undefeated, and it just feels the way you might remember it should in October. Thanks for joining us tonight for another program along the virtual long walk. In my 7 years now in my travels for Trinity, so many alumni comment on how amazing their faculty members were, and they often ask, how are they doing? Well, today we'll hear from some. With help from the esteemed Borden Painter, we organized a similar program a year ago for homecoming, and it was, no surprise, a smashing success. Borden was a part-time Trinity instructor at first, but we all have George Cooper to thank for convincing him to join Trinity full-time in 1966. Professor Painter taught courses in English and European history, including Tudor and Stuart England, Renaissance and Reformation Europe, and modern Italy. He served as department chairman twice, dean of the faculty from 1984 to 1987, director of Italian programs from 1989 all the way up to 2004, and interim president twice, from 94 to 95 and from 2003 to 2004. And in fact, upon his retirement in 2004, the trustees named him Trinity's 20th president. Borden, it's an honor to turn the program over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. Our thanks to Steve for getting us together and organizing this, and Bonnie behind the scenes who's handling the technology. Very pleased to be joined by 5 colleagues who will get going in a minute. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask each one to reflect for about 5 minutes on any reminiscences, highlights of their years at Trinity. Of course, if any of them should go on too long, I will give them a subtle reminder to shorten it, but they won't. After that, Steve will return and field the questions. So there are 2 ways you can participate. One is asking questions, use the Q&A. The other is you can write in comments, which will go out to others, and those are a lot of fun to hear from different people. And we'll have an hour or so to be together. We were just joking before we came on that some of us had to retire because we couldn't keep up with the technology. I know that was true in my case. But I must say, this last year, both at Trinity and elsewhere, these Zoom meetings and all do have a lot to say for them. The way we can gather so many people, no matter where they are, in this case, to share our interest in Trinity. By the way, one of the questions that came in ahead of time from Carl Zimmerman, class of 61, who was a Caroliner, was what people thought of the carillons. Now, I know there were, in my day, people in Jarvis who found them a little too close and noisy. I always enjoyed them. And Carl, you probably overlapped with my friend and classmate, Ralph Lawson, who was a carilliner. So I got up to see how all that worked early on. In the summer, for many of us in the Hartford area, it's still a great treat to come in on a Wednesday evening for a carillon concert and sit on the quad and enjoy that remarkable instrument. We're going to start off. I'm going to ask Milla Riggio to kick off the proceedings with some of her recollections and comments about her days at Trinity. Milla?
Hi. Hi, thank you, Borden. I want to say that I remember Borden in many ways, as we all do, as a partner and co-teacher in a program we called Guided Studies. He and I team taught history and lit courses. But I remember him perhaps most as the dean who knew how to do what he called, quote, creative financing. Consider first if a project is worth doing, he would say, and then ask how you can pay for it. This wonderful approach allowed many projects that would otherwise have been killed at the starting gate, including my own foray into the world of Iranian Shiite Muslim drama and processional celebrations that literally changed my life, into which so many of my students followed me. So thank you, Borden. I was a professor of English. I came to Trinity after getting my English PhD at Harvard. I chose Trinity precisely for that flexibility that Borden epitomizes. I wanted the freedom to take what Robert Frost calls the road less traveled by. And it worked. Thanks to people like Borden, I not only got to teach Anglo-Saxon literature and to host mead hall dinners and roast suckling pigs, which we did only once, but also produce medieval and Shakespeare plays in the United States and Canada, an Iranian Shiite Tazieh play, that was an adventure, to organize conferences on all of these subjects, and finally to end up in the Caribbean, where for almost 30 years I have studied Carnival and other festivals to study creative play, an interest I share with Drew Hyland, also on this panel, who was also a partner in Guided Studies in the Humanities, which I assume some of you attending this webinar studied. You were fabulous students, those teaching years memorable. I have never believed that learning stops at the classroom door or that the, quote, real world is somewhere else. I have always thought that learning and life coincide, and Trinity gave me the unique opportunity to prove that true. It let me teach not only English majors, but also biology and math students, students from every discipline in my English courses. Crossing the boundaries. We are good at that. I must say, I don't often get to sign in as a younger member of any team these days. I'm pretty sure that at 80, I am not actually younger in years here either. But in terms of total Trinity time, today I get that honor. Ward Curran, whose daughter was my English major advisee at Trinity, was here when I got here in 1971, just a couple of years after women were admitted to the college. I was one of the first women faculty members hired, and Robin came a few years later. Dave Weiner, whom I knew before he became Dean of Students, a job I myself had turned down only a few years after I got to Trinity. Drew, who used to take me, I hope you remember this, Drew, to play basketball as the only woman in the pickup games played in Unit D of the gym, came a few years before me. Only Robin is younger in every way, and as we all appreciate. I knew Robin through my years of squash playing friendship with Chet McPhee in the athletic department and in many, many other ways. Coming as one of the first women was an adventure, which we revisited 50 years later in 2019. The most exhausting part of being a woman in a man's academic world was that we had to be thrown out front, always visible. I directed the first year seminar program my second year at Trinity, 1 year ahead of the students, to be greeted in the faculty coffee room as our, quote, chair leader. I think you all get the picture. I was acting chair of my department in my third year. I was the first female faculty member to give birth. That was an adventure of its own. Then, in a year when I did not have a new baby, an older economics professor, by the way, not Ward, congratulated me on the long walk for having given birth to Professor Carl Haberlant and Susie Martin's baby. A student mistook me for another faculty member and told me to get to my office right away because she was looking for me. She thought I was Andrea Bianchini in the Modern Languages department. I could go on and on about the stories of what it meant to be an early woman at Trinity, which was generally a good thing. But I want to finish this short reminiscence by focusing on what brought me to Trinity in the first place. My students, you all. I had learned that at Harvard, where I had just turned down a job to come to Trinity, your biggest job was to teach the students that they were not quite as smart as they thought they were, to convince them that they actually had something you could teach them, something they could learn from you. Trinity students, in contrast, you got to teach them that they were smarter than they thought they were. They had not achieved their highest aim in life just by being admitted to Trinity, and they were often what I call sleepers. Much more intelligent than they even knew sometimes, and they were willing to learn. They would follow you long distances in order to learn. And sometimes by distance, I really mean distance. I took my students to Rome. I took my students to Brazil. I took my students to the country of Colombia, to the great chagrin of one of our deans, but it was a very safe trip, and often to Trinidad. But you also take them on distances intellectually, and they would follow you there. They themselves become excited about what they can do and accomplish. They are eager, grateful, and willing to work. I know this is not the stereotype of Trinity students, but it was my experience of my students. They were sometimes the only undergraduates in graduate student conferences or seminars. They invariably held their own. They often starred. I used them as editorial assistants on my edited books. They ran my conferences. They performed in my plays. I once told a classroom filled with 75 students studying Shakespeare, bunches of them from the sciences, I don't have to do drugs. I get to teach. And for 46 years, I meant it. Trinity exacts serious scholarship from its faculty. We do not build our careers on teaching alone. We have to produce the books required for tenure, and that's just fine, because it means we are keeping our own intellectual selves alive. But it is a teaching institution. We hire teachers, and we expect them to teach. Then the Trinity students, and over a 46-year period of time, I could name a bunch of you all, repay us big time for that effort. You become our learning partners, and it is fun, and it is productive, and that is what I miss as I pursue my own interests in retirement. That, and also perhaps the Carillon, which I too loved listening to. So thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you so much, Milla, for getting us off to a good start. I'm going to turn it over now to Drew Hyland.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to talk about three highlights of the many highlights of my experience at Trinity, just for a few minutes each. The first was a program away from the campus that I started in the spring of 1968. I gave it the formal title, Human Being, Play, and Nature. But the students with much more panache than me quickly labeled it Skiing and Being. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I want to talk about the course in the philosophy of sport that I developed over the years. And finally, I want to talk briefly about one of the great educational and teaching experiences of my life, which was coaching. I was Robin Sheppard's assistant coach for a few years, and I want to talk about that. So beginning with what I'll call by its famous name, Skiing and Being. My early years at Trinity, 1967, I arrived in the fall of 1967. Those were strange and unusual years in college education. There was a peculiar conjunction of the politics of confrontation going on, mostly centered around the Vietnam War, with the growing popularity of the drug culture. And to make a very long story short, the upshot of that was that I was experiencing in my classes students coming to class in all manner of extraordinary consciousness, shall we say. And I was really dismayed by this because I couldn't figure out, how to get across the ideas I wanted to get out. And so I went one day to Robert Fuller, who was the dean at that time, a wild and crazy dean, who, and I said, this is really a problem I'm having with so many students showing up just having finished some marijuana or much stronger substances. And he asked me what I thought I should have to do about it. And I said, I have to get the students away from the campus, because the campus is the locus of what's going on here. And so I devised this idea of taking 15 students with me, and the way it worked was they took all their courses from me for the semester, all 4 courses from me, and I taught nothing but those 4 courses to that group of students. So we didn't have to be on campus any longer. And so for 3 years in the winter semester, I took the students to Vermont, and we developed this program that, as I say, was very, very multidisciplinary. And we had 4 seminars: Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, and Thursday night were the seminars each week. Just a number of things happened in those seminars that really taught me a lot about teaching. The first thing was that we were all studying the same things in all the courses. So all of the students knew what each of us were studying, and we could therefore refer back and forth from one night to another, and everyone would know about it. That brought about a peculiar intensity. I've never had a teaching experience as intense as happened in skiing and being. And the results, I think, speak for themselves. There are PhDs in philosophy and English literature and other things all over the country who graduated, as it were, from skiing and being. Second was philosophy of sport. And again, I want to say a word about why I developed that program, that course. I was fortunate enough, at least in my own opinion, fortunate to have been an athlete in college. I played basketball at Princeton, where I was an undergraduate. And it was an immensely powerful experience to me. And yet, in those, let me just expand a little bit on that for a moment. I was learning so much about myself, about other people, about the world through my experience playing basketball. And yet, not one of my professors at this great institution of learning ever said to me, "You ought to be thinking about this. There's something that you ought to be learning and articulating about this experience." So I used to joke, in fact, that the only connection between my academics and my athletic careers at Princeton was that every once in a while, one of the professors would ask me for tickets to a sold-out basketball game. But when I came to Trinity, I didn't want my students to be able to say what I had to say. Namely, there's not a single professor who ever suggested to me that this ought to be thought about. And so I developed this course, which I taught every other year for practically the entire time I was at Trinity. And the guiding point of the course was really to make them thoughtful about this deep experience they had. Which leads me to the third thing, which was when Trinity went co-ed, Robin was, I think, the second woman hired in the athletic department. And talk about loading up her plate immediately. She came as the head coach of field hockey, lacrosse, and basketball. The head coach of three different sports. In field hockey and in lacrosse, Robin became the legendary coach that you all know about. By her own admission, however, she was, let's say, at the beginning of her knowledge of basketball. And we were talking about this one day, and I said, "Well, look, I'll come down and just give one clinic on offense, one clinic on defense." And I don't want to talk too long, so that led to my helping coach Robin for all those years. I just want to mention a couple things about that experience. There's something amazing about coaching as a teaching opportunity, because for us who are academic teachers, we try to grasp their intellects. We get hold of their intellects and try to get their intellects involved. Coaches of sports teams have the person's whole being involved. Their bodies are involved, their minds are involved, their psyches are involved, their sense of self-identity is involved. And it makes for an amazingly powerful opportunity to teach them. On the other hand, it also confers an amazing responsibility, because coaches are going to influence their players. We academics, if we're lucky, influence our students, but coaches are going to influence them positively or negatively, and that seems to me confers a huge responsibility on coaches, not a single one of which ever did better at it than Robin Sheppard.
Thank you, Drew. Okay, your turn, Robin.
People should know, who are listening, that the panelists did not talk to each other about what we were going to say. So I think this is a good thing. You're going to see some overlap between Drew and myself, and Milla as well. Drew, I don't know if you remember this. I'll get to the coaching in a little while, but I actually went with you to one of your skiing and bean classes in Vermont. And I also audited your philosophy of sport class. So I remember them almost as fondly as you on the basketball court. So I'd like to start by saying that I wish I could say that I was working on my PhD before I was hired at Trinity, but alas, I was a senior in college, looking forward to graduation, 22 years of age, when I was offered the job in 1974. And as Milla mentioned, Trinity, many of us know, went co-ed in 1969. They almost immediately were looking to create competitive sports programs for women, which is fantastic. But they were doing it, I don't want to say on the cheap, but they were doing it efficiently with 2-year grad assistants who had just recently graduated from colleges that offered physical education degrees. So some of you may remember the great Jane Millspa. She was the very first woman hired to get the programs started. And fortunately for me, when they were looking to hire a second person for 2 years, they went to my alma mater, Trenton State College, now College of New Jersey. I heard through word of mouth, I applied, I got hired, And I came for literally 2 years and twisted that into a 41-year career. My role, as Drew mentioned, I taught physical education classes during the day. I coached field hockey, basketball, and lacrosse in the afternoon. And then in the evening, I took graduate courses so that I could acquire my master's in that 2-year period. So back to Drew, Coach Hyland, there was one snag in this, and he was very kind. I actually got cut from my basketball team in 9th grade. That's like the tail end of junior high school. And Trinity hired me to coach on the court these, what turned out to be some really great athletes. I mean, Drew and I could name them all: Nancy McDermott, Lanier Drew, Sue Levin, on, Scylla Williams. And someone introduced Drew and I, and he's right. He was, I'm almost embarrassed to say he was my assistant coach. He really ran the show, so much so, and I don't mind admitting this, Drew lived pretty far off campus, and basketball's in the winter. So when the weather wasn't very good, there were at least 2 times that Drew called and said, I don't think I'm going to make it to the 8 o'clock game. And I am telling you folks, I'm not much of a prayer, but I prayed we would either win by 30 or we would get crushed, because there is no way I knew how to call a tight game, a close game. I didn't know what to say at timeouts. So Drew, I am forever in your debt, as are those fantastic women who were on those teams and were so patient with me. I'm going to real quickly go through some recollections, some reflections that just popped up when I was asked to be on this panel. There's first one was that the guys in the athletic department, and besides Jane Millspaw and Mrs. Ruby, they were all guys, Mrs. Ruby being our women's equipment manager, they were incredibly supportive and tied in to our success. We were, in fact, invading their space. They were sharing their indoor facilities. They were giving up their outdoor field space. They had to take on extra duties for the women's programs that we were trying to get kickstarted. And so I just wanted to go on record as naming them, because so many of you listening will remember certainly our athletic director, Carl Kurth, my dear friend and Milla's Chet McPhee, Roby Schultz, Leo Hamill, Rabbit, who can forget Rabbit? And even, I'm going to tell you, Frank Marchese. Now, it took about 10 years for Frank Marchese to like me, but I eventually got coffee in that equipment room. And those guys were my fathers away from home. So I think of them with great fond memories. The other reflection is that the college, in my opinion, was instrumental in helping our department recruit talented female athletes. And how did they do that? They did that by what I'm calling reverse recruiting. I didn't know recruiting. Howie Muir would be up in admissions as our director of admissions. He'd be interviewing a female possible applicant candidate. She happened to play field hockey, basketball, or lacrosse. He'd call me up. He'd say, I got a good one. He'd send her down. We'd get her to apply. They ended up to be an All-American. So it was the absolute reverse of what's happening, has been happening, and is happening now. And it worked. Because there was no official recruiting, we weren't using, at the time, Division I terms like recruits and walk-ons and all that. What we did, and some of the women listening will remember this, I ran around the dorms from a mimeograph, posted flyers. You don't need any experience. Come on down. We're going to have a meeting. We're trying to create a lacrosse program. And I'm telling you, 50 or 60, one time there were 70 women sitting on the grass waiting to play. Now, they wanted to play varsity, but if they didn't get to play varsity, we had JV programs. They joined in. We practiced together. We had games together. We played on a decent grass field. Sometimes it was a little long. It ran east-west, so the sun would set over the long walk there and blind the goalkeeper, you know, in the cage. And we just had a blast. We wore the men's old uniforms and we had a blast. And one of my memories comes the carillon bells. Every single practice, they would chime. I don't know if it was 5 or 5:30 or 6, but we were out there on those old field hockey and lacrosse fields, and we stopped. We stopped what we were doing and just stared at the chapel. So those are a great, great memory for me. And another memory is that when I retired from the sideline in 1999, I became a full-time administrator as the associate AD, and I twisted Frank Kirkpatrick's arm into letting me teach a first-year seminar, which I then did for 8 years because I loved it so much. I taught and advised just some wonderful students. Many were athletes, many were not athletes. And if any of you are listening tonight, you were truly a highlight of my career. And I have to tell Drew, he thinks coaching on the field is hard around the court. Coaching in that classroom was rough. That was rough. I like having that playing time, you know, hanging over them. Lastly, and Milla has mentioned this, one of my fondest recollections is that Ferris was filled with academic faculty that just gelled with the athletic faculty. Drew, I didn't realize Milla was also playing basketball. I remember Drew playing new time basketball. I remember Milla going up to the squash courts. I remember Henry DePhillips out on the tennis courts, Gus Sapega running around the track. It was, excuse this overused word, but it was organic. It just happened. And after they played, they stopped in your office all sweaty, and it just was a flow. So then I felt comfortable going to them when I needed a favor. And I'm not sure those things happen anymore. I think everybody's schedules have become so booked up. Noon times are all used up. And I miss those days. And I'm a little sad that the faculty, both athletic and academic, and the students, most importantly, aren't sharing in that wonderful experience. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. And now on to the dismal science with Ward Curran.
Oh. Thank you for that introduction, Borden. The dismal science. First, before I start, let me not remind myself that I remember Milla was very kind to our daughter Colleen, and excuse me, somebody taught her to swim. I wonder who that was. But what I wanted to start with tonight was the fact that I came to Trinity as an Illinois scholar in the fall of 1953. And when I got here, I had right away 4 very good professors who taught German, chemistry, history, and the other subject which I took, English. And what I learned from them, and I won't get their names out right now or at this point, but what I learned from them was something about the difference between a liberal arts college and what I might have otherwise experienced. And that is the nature, the teaching, the interest of those faculty in students. And that has guided my approach to teaching all my life. Now, once I was, as I said, I was the Illinois Scholar. I came back to Trinity largely by accident for 2 years, which turned into 52 years. But was back here because one of the economics professors, a man named Jack Oang, had left. Some people thought he was with the CIA when he was here, but he had left, and before long he was premier of South Vietnam. He didn't last very long, but he survived the takeover and became an advisor to the government of Vietnam. Now, when I started to teach, I had the same idea that I would try to do what professors had done for me, and that is to instill not only the subject matter that I was teaching, but also to handle and to be with them and listen to problems that they may have. And I was one of the first people to teach a freshman seminar, as they were called in those days. And I taught it for several times. And of course, it was popular because it was called Financial Panics in American History. The only problem was that many of the students didn't have a lot of American history, so I had to teach some of that too. But I had a different number of people in a class where the primary purpose was to have them write. And that's what I did. Now, with respect to my courses in economics, the dismal science, as Borden likes to call it, I think that was Thomas Carlyle who first uttered that commentary about the field. And what I taught, not only principles of economics, but I taught a course, started it, in financial economics. And it was difficult to get it taught in a liberal arts college because I called it corporate finance. But as the Nobel Law Prizes were awarded, or the Nobel Memorial Prizes, to the theory, in it, I changed the approach considerably. Now, you people say you had some problem with students taking courses. I had trouble with students taking courses because somebody's father said, if you don't take this class, the finance class, I won't pay the tuition. So that became a problem for me at the opposite end of the spectrum. Then I had, and I'll only do a few of these, because there's so many of you out there in that audience that I knew well, and I could talk about stories that would be about you, and I'm not going to do that if I can help it. But I had a student one time who came to my class. He came in, sat down, and said, Professor Curran, I'd like to take your finance course. And I said, well, do you have the prerequisites? He said, no, only principles of economics. I said, well, I don't really want to take anybody in. I said, I sometimes make an exception for mathematics majors and scientists because they grasp the concepts relatively easily. And he said, well, I really have a reason why I want to do this. And I said, well, can you tell me the reason? He said, no, I can't until the end of the course. I promise you, I will be there every day. I will come in when I have questions, and so on and so forth. And he was sincere. This was not a con job. And when he said that, I finally said, okay, it's your funeral, you might not pass this course. Well, maybe he was taking it pass, fail, probably was. So he took the course. He was there every day in class. he would ask questions, but not in class. He'd come up afterwards and so on. So finally, the end of the course, he had about somewhere between 72 and 73. And I thought, well, I'll look at these other students in the class and I do him no disservice to, instead of a C minus, to make it a C. And so then I said, come in and see me. I have to have the answer to this question. So he came in and he sat down and I said, why did you torture yourself taking this class when you didn't want to do so? And his answer was, now I can talk with my father. That was the most unusual experience I think I ever had in teaching. So my problem was the opposite than some of you. I had to tell students, actually one student I had was very good, but all he wanted to do was come in and talk to me about finance. I said, that's the liberal arts college. Are you taking history courses? Are you taking English literature courses? Are you taking language courses? Beyond the basic requirements, he wasn't. But anyway, those are the things that I had to do, which were different. Now, on the more humorous side of it, when I first came back, I played 4 years of football at Trinity. And I came back and I said to Dan Jesse, the late Dan Jesse, who was a legend in his time. Most people don't know that Dan Jesse wrote 2 books on baseball. He was coach baseball. He was a president of the American Football Coaches Association in his last year at Trinity. And he introduced in my senior year a defense called a 5-4 suicide, which the Detroit Lions employed later in their championship game. Now, I said to Jesse, could I help you out in the coaching? You know what, Drew? He never asked me to do so. So I had great respect for him, and I still have great respect for the late Dan Jesse. But what I look back on all of it, and I say to myself, what was there about Trinity? Well, initially, Trinity was kind of a family, because when I started out teaching, there were about 1,000 students in the classroom. Now it's less so. Things change. You live and to learn, and you change with them. But this was one of many experiences I want to tell everybody about, and I want everybody to know that I made certain that students took other courses. Thank you.
Thank you, Ward. And now to wrap it up with all kinds of interesting stories, Professor of Psychology and Dean of Students, David Weiner.
Well, thank you, Borden, and good evening to all you alumni who are out there. I want to make a comment that relates primarily to Robin and Drew. As the Dean of Students, you deal with lots of kids who are not doing too well academically. And I can say that every coach and assistant coach that I ever had contact with at Trinity College would do everything they could to get these kids to get good grades. And it wasn't because they just wanted to win the NESCAC school title or anything like that. It was because they cared about these kids and they wanted them to succeed. In fact, Robin and I shared places on a group shortly before I retired that we talked about a lot of these kids and tried to help them out. In the spring of 1966, I was doing my PhD dissertation at the Institute of Living. And for those who don't remember, the Institute of Living is, I think, the second oldest private psychiatric hospital in the country. at the same time, there was a professor at Trinity who taught what was known then as physiological psychology. And none of the people in the psychology department, other than that one person, really were familiar with that area of psychology. So this guy got a job offer from Brown and he left. So the then chair of the psychology department, for some reason, called the Institute of Living, and they put me on the phone and they said, why don't you come over to Trinity? We need someone to do this sort of thing. So I went over to Trinity and I spent 2 hours with the then chair of the department. And then he brought me over to Williams, where I spent another hour with the then dean of the faculty. And after the 3 hours were up, they said, congratulations, we're going to hire you. It doesn't happen that way anymore. And it hasn't happened that way for, for many, many years. But I did my teaching, I did my research, and I've got some good stories about that if we have time. And then I earned tenure, and then in 1976, a person who shall remain nameless, but one who is very active at the college as an adult, but didn't work there, but he was a trustee. And he said to me, Weiner, why don't you go see a guy by the name of Tom Smith? He is the vice president. In those days, we had one dean of faculty, one dean of students, and one vice president. And so I called up Tom, and I didn't really know much about him, but we spent a couple of hours together, and it became very obvious to me that here was a guy who really knew people, liked people, and had a marvelous sense of humor. And I think he did things for the college that probably many people don't know. And in my mind, he was sort of the glue of the college for many years. So anyway, I applied for the Dean of Students job. And on 2 days, 2 consecutive days, I had 8 hours of interviews. For some of the faculty here, one of the people who interviewed me was in the history department, and George Cooper was his name. He was secretary of the college, and he interviewed me for quite an extensive period of time. And he looked at me once and he said, I want you to know that I'm not winking at you. Now, for those of you who remember George, he had a tick in his eye, but he had no idea that I knew it was a tick in the eye. So anyway, I applied for the job. I had interviews with students, trustees, other faculty, and so forth. And nothing was coming around. So I called Smith, and in those days, I called him Mr. Smith. And I said, could you tell me what's happening? I applied for this deanship, and I know some other faculty have. And what's going on? I haven't heard from you for a month. And he said, Weiner, he often called me Weiner. We wanted a woman, and you're the closest thing to it. You were hired. So that was my real formal introduction to Tom Smith, who really, in my mind, taught me how to be an administrator. But I also felt that I was a teacher. I liked research. I did publications, but I really liked teaching. And much of what I did in the Dean of Students office was teaching. Some of it was emotional teaching, some of it wasn't. But for those of you who have forgotten, the Dean of Students had responsibility for the medical office, the counseling center, the career center, the chaplain, the all the departments in Mather Hall, residential life, the calendar office, and security. And security was a fascinating place to work. And we usually hired retired policemen from Hartford. And there were two types of security people. The older ones who had retired from the police department looked at their job as door checkers, and say they would walk around the quadrangle on at various points of time during the evening, and they check all the doors. Then there was another group of security guys who were very, very young, and what they really wanted to do was be police people. And I call these people the Starsky and Hutch group. And I can remember one night, I was basically on call 24/7 for 22 years. And although I had people assist me in being on call, I was pretty much the last stop. So one night I was called and told that a young man who was probably inebriated was up on the roof of the chapel. And obviously it was a dangerous place for him, whether he was sober or not. And so I made a deal with him in front of who I called Starsky and Hutch. And I said to him, if he came down safely through the stairways that led to the top, we would talk about it, but we weren't going to suspend him or anything like that. And I felt very good about that. And the kid came down, and then Starsky and Hutch chased him all over the soccer field in a car, in a Trinity car, ruining Sheppard's field. But anyway, we got through it, and Starsky and Hutch, I don't think they ever became policemen. But you know, one of the things that I did, I learned, a lot of people said, well, you really deal with the underbelly of the college. And I didn't look at it that way. I mean, there were some tough problems on occasion, and we had to deal very firmly with them. But I looked at it as assisting young people in growing up. And it was a wonderful experience for me. And one of the things I learned, not from Tom Smith, but I guess I came up with it myself, was when a student was sent to me for discipline, I would always try and differentiate whether the student was mischievous or malicious. And that had a lot to do with how I would handle them. A typical, we can't get into some of the more difficult ones, but a typical student who was not malicious, but he would come in, and this is an actual kid I remember. He was very short, and I at the time was probably 5'9". I'm much shorter now, but he looked like he was about 5'4", and he had done something, I forget what, and I said to him, but Frank, I don't know what his name was, but look what you did. And he said to me, but Dean, I only had 2 6s. Now, if 2 6s are 12 cans of beer. And for this little guy, I was surprised he was still with us after 12 cans of beer. Another unusual story occurred. I always had research assistants, and they were, I'm just reading something that's on the screen to me. Thank you very much. I had a student who would take care of the rats that I was using to teach students how to do brain surgery. And I taught them how to anesthetize these rats, and how to test the rats, and how to inject various things into them, and so forth. And one year I said to he was really a research assistant, it was the fall of '68, because that was the year that Trinity and Vassar had their exchange. And the women from Vassar, I think, were on the first floor in the North Campus. And so I went home after telling the guy to euthanize these rats. In those days, it was very common to do, and you did it with a certain chemical, and the rats did not suffer, except when they were working for me. But anyway, the next morning, I think it was a Friday morning, I was sitting in the psych department meeting, and I think George Stoughton was the chair of the department then. And a lot of other names you may remember, like Carl Harbelant and me and a few others. And suddenly there's a knock on the door from a state policeman. George had a little outer office, which held however many there were of us. And the state policeman said, "Is there a Professor Weiner here?" And believe me, I was the only whiner there. And he said, "I would like you to come with me down to the Humane Society and identify your rats." So that was sort of a shock to me. And what had happened was that my research assistant probably had a couple of beers more than he should have. And he took all the rats, and they had little contraptions on their heads through which we could implant electrodes. And he took them all down to North Campus just to meet the women from Vassar. And then after he got his jollies that way, he then rounded them all up and he put them on the Capitol steps. And then he went back to campus, and all that the state policeman knew was that these rats with the funny looking heads had migrated from the Capitol steps to Bushnell Park. And so they called places where research is being done with rats. And one of them was the Institute of Living. And they talked to the guy who was head of research there. He said, "Yeah, I know there's some guy who used to do his dissertation here, but he's now teaching at Trinity." Well, that was that. And I guess the only thing I can say about my research assistant is he left college early.
Thank you, Dave. We've got to, the time is running out, so I want to ask Steve Donovan if we have time for any questions, a couple of questions before we sign off. Thank you.
Thanks. Did everybody stick to the 5 or 6 minutes, Borden?
I don't think so. But we covered a lot of territory.
Yeah, well, thank goodness you all didn't. The comments are inspiring. And just so that folks know, we will preserve the comments if the faculty members aren't watching them. We'll save them and be sure to share them. The comments are heartwarming. Maybe one question from Stan Marcus. He asked this earlier today and then again tonight. He directed it at Ward Curran first and then asked others to jump in. And I know Ward has been preparing for this question all day. So Stan from the great class of 63 asks, "I would love to hear what each of you would do differently today if you were a faculty member. What lessons would you impart to your successors, and would today's imperatives change your perspective?" So, Ward,
Well,
perhaps you want to start there.
You want me to start? Okay. I had no trouble imparting financial economics and the changes that were made since you graduated. And I had no trouble doing any of that. I wrote 2 books published, McGraw-Hill and Harcourt Brace. But as the technology changed, it became somewhat more difficult to work. I would use handouts, overheads, And if were still there, I would have used the latest technology to lecture. And what that meant was that I, in some cases, would lose contact with the students, which I did not want to do. When you were there, Stan, I didn't lose contact with the students because we didn't have anything except you, your classmates, and me and a blackboard. And that, as that changed, it made more difficult to communicate. Now, some of my colleagues may think otherwise, but for me, that's the single important factor.
If I may comment on the same question, when I went back to my place in the psychology department in 2000, I again taught freshman seminars and I taught senior seminars. And I had become very interested in the whole circumference of inequality. And I taught courses on sexism and racism. There was this white guy teaching courses on racism, but I had a lot of friends of color who would come in and lecture. And what I did, not only did I teach the freshman seminar about racism and sexism, but then when the same kids were seniors, and if they were psychology majors, I would have them read the same books they read as freshmen as beginning, and then they would read other things. And the change in how they viewed the writing of these books, the depth of thought they gave to them, and their whole understanding of what it means to be in an unequal situation. It was like these two groups had never read the books the same. It was very different. And if I were to go back to teach, which I certainly will not do, I would like to do that again. It's really fascinating to have a senior comment on some of the same books that she or he may have read in their freshman seminar. The difference is huge. And it showed me that these youngsters were growing up, were becoming more intellectually thoughtful, and I think it worked out pretty well.
Can I say a quick word also in answer to this question? I was thinking about it and I thought I didn't have an answer to it, and suddenly I think I do. I think for all of us, for those of us you're seeing here, our teaching, I think it's a very American approach to teaching, depends on our students. We have to find our students where they are. It was always my philosophy that you can't stand across the Grand Canyon and yell at them and expect them to find you, that it's your job to find them. And so if I were still teaching, I think I would have to get into the classroom and find out who those students are. And then I think they would help me understand how to help them learn what they need to learn in this moment of their history. Not being in the classroom, I have no idea what that would be. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Steve, anything else? Are we?
Well, if you're watching the comments, you're seeing a number of people be so grateful and thankful and also jumping off. And let me just read one comment and then let you, Borden, and anyone else decide how you'd like to close out this evening. Edward Huntley says, for anyone who's not seeing the comment screen or the chat screen, thank you all very much for sharing your time and memories with us. If anyone ever asks why they should attend Trinity rather than any other school, we need to encourage them to watch the recording of this session. What an inspiring way to spend an evening. So thank you for that, Edward Huntley, and lots of others with very similar sentiments. I just offer my thanks to the faculty and to the guests tonight. And Borden, I'll let you wrap this up in any way you see fit.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. Thanks again for getting us together. Thanks to my colleagues, fellow panelists. I know more about you now than I did at the beginning of the hour. Very informative. Reminded me of my basketball career, which wound up in the 6th grade when I scored 4 points of the 18 points that took the championship at Muncie Park Elementary School in Manhasset, Long Island. And that was the end of my basketball career. This has been a great deal of fun. Wonderful to see all the comments coming in from our former students and now alums. I hope we can do something like this again in the future. Thank you all. And as Edward R. Murrow would say, good night and good luck.
They ever knew who Edward R. Murrow was.
We'll get into that next time.
Thanks, everybody.